Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you again from Film Fanatic headquarters. Hope everyone's doing good. It's about 10 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. So, I want to thank everybody again for supporting this channel. I've said in previous shows, I've always been surprised by certain movies that I do little posts about, whether they're little reviews or maybe specialty shows, but more so around the more or less the primary focus of this channel, where I talk about all my favorite horror exploitation movies and also lots of films, tons of films in that respected genre that I've been discovering, as well as directors. Lots of obscure movies. Like I've said before, when I buy movies, I tend to buy mostly. I mostly go to Bull Moose, and I usually set out when I go there now to try to find pretty rare movies, obscure movies, movies that I grew up watching, and I try to find the other thing that I kind of really focus on when I buy these movies is I try to focus on a lot of, super underground movies and really obscure movies. And I've switched, I more or less did like an about face of where, like I've said before, in years past when I started becoming a pretty avid collector of films, I would typically buy movies that I had seen before, and maybe I had only seen it once or twice, or I saw it growing up on VHS or a movie I used to see on cable. So it was always centered around films that I was really familiar with, and that would be what I would usually buy. And I still do that. I obviously that's still a focus, but now it's switched a lot to where I try to buy lots of films that I haven't seen before, and I've really lucked out. And it's really due to, one great example of that is a director that who is probably my favorite horror exploitation director, Lucio Fulci, famous Italian director. I grew up as a kid during the days of the VHS days, and when video stores were a regular, commonplace thing in our world. Grew up watching a lot of his films, The Gates of Hell and House by the Cemetery, Zombie. So many, amazing, iconic exploitation movies. And since I've been diving back into that world, I've also discovered a whole bunch of other Italian directors and other foreign film directors and also American directors that I haven't seen that are, kind of looked at to be part of that genre. So, along with like buying those films that I grew up watching, I kind of switched the focus to where I'm trying to buy things now that are related to that. And I've had really good luck. I've been amazed. I haven't really gotten any films or anything that I don't know. The only way to put it is I haven't gotten any films that I think suck. Like I've gotten turned on to so many cool things, and I love it because it just broadens or opens up that cavern to to exploring new films and new filmmakers in those styles, and it just like opens up a whole another world. And plus, the other factor is also the price range for a lot of these films is really, really good, if not really reasonable. Occasionally, I'll buy a movie that, we'll say, for instance, like a Lucio Fulci movie, or like a Bruno Mattei movie, or Dario Argento, directors that I was really familiar with. And there's certain films that I've been looking for over, a period of time, and I come across them, and they might be in the $25 or possibly $30 range for a Blu-ray, like a collector's edition. and occasionally I buy I will buy those because they're kind of rare, or they're just the packaging and the package itself is just so amazing. But for the most part, prices are really good, and I generally don't spend that much money on each movie. They're generally like under $20. So, and I usually buy. Blue Moose has an amazing like used selection of books, movies, DVDs, Blu-rays, 4Ks, mostly DVDs and Blu-rays, and also with CDs, cassettes, albums, mostly with CDs. And as far as music, and as far as if you're dealing with music, but most of the stuff I've been buying the last couple of years or last year, where I've been diving even more into that world, have been brand new releases, unused. So I've been even more surprised by the price range. So it's been pretty amazing, and I love discovering all of these new directors and all of these new films. It's been so awesome, and then also revisiting directors that I knew about and I had seen some of their films growing up, but realizing now as I've gotten older and I've gotten a little bit more serious about it, realizing, oh wow, that I've seen. Well, one example I could say that I can use is Jess Franco. He's emerged. He's been emerging lately as one of my favorite exploitation directors, and he's definitely one of my favorite directors overall. And he was a Spanish director. And growing up, there were a few of his films that I remember seeing as a kid. One in particular, I remember, which was one of the first movies I've done that I did a review on, was a movie with Telly Savalas from the '80s called Facelift. Just an incredible movie. There was that movie and maybe one or two other ones that I remember seeing back in the VHS days. And so, like an example of that is a few months ago, I was at Bull Moose and I was going through the aisles and I saw that they had Facelift, the Jess Franco movie, and I was like, wow, okay, awesome. I remember this movie, and this is, I hadn't seen it in I don't know how many years, and it was a really good price. It was a great package, all kinds of, the artwork was amazing, came with all these great special features and interviews and documentaries. So I picked it up, and I've been just blown away by that movie. It just can't get enough of it, and then so that caused me to investigate a little bit further. Okay, what other movies did Jess Franco did? And then so over time I've discovered that he's like responsible for almost about 100 movies, and there's like tons of his films I haven't seen. So I've been buying those slowly, and that's been an amazing thing. And then directors that are kind of similar in his world, that's the same thing, that I haven't heard of, or films that in that style that I haven't never seen before. So it's great, and all of the labels. One of my favorite labels that I've talked a lot about is Mondo Macabra, and they really specialize on a huge variety of all of these weird, obscure exploitation movies, sci-fi, horror based, sexploitation films that are just amazing and shocking and just so incredibly raw. And they seem to really take that deep dive, and as well as Blue Underground and Mono Macabre is probably my favorite two labels, but there's so many great ones. Severin and just yeah, just an amazing. At the end of the day, I think it's an amazing time to be alive if you're a film collector. It's unbelievable the titles that are available, and I don't really know. You know, it is a little weird too because I don't know how long this whole thing will be around. I have noticed it a little bit at Blue Moose where their selection of their exploitation films has kind of gone down a little bit. I don't know if it's because I'm buying a lot, but I've noticed it's gotten a little bit smaller. And I've seen interviews with various people that work for those companies, and they kind of feel it's like they're in a situation where they're just hitting it hard because there is a market, but they don't really think it's going to last. They think it might more or less come to close to a degree as far as the demand within a few years. So it's an interesting time, but that's also revs me up a little bit more to try to buy these movies while the prices are good and while there's a lot of great content coming out. So I think at the end of the day there'll be all kinds of the people that are the deranged film collectors like I am. They'll always be around. It's a smaller group of people. There is already a smaller group of people, but it's like at a cult status. But there's but they're so fired up and excited about the style that they're willing to drop money. So I don't think that will ever go around. There will always be a demand for it, and there always will be an audience, even though it's not. It's on the fringe side of society, and as far as commercial films go, and people that will spend money for various other things. So yeah, before I get into this collection of movies, I guess I can call I would call it that more so than anything else. Just wanted to give a little update on some of. Oh, and what I was my original point was the thing I've been so surprised about is a lot of the movies that I cover. I've been the main focus is trying to bring light to a lot of like really obscure grindhouse exploitation movies, and I've been just amazed by these movies that are totally underground, and a lot of films that I just took a chance buying. I've been amazed by the amount of people who have been checking those out, and those movies remain now or right up until a day or two ago. They remain the highest, most watched films, or where people chime into those more. They have more views. A lot of those films have 2 or 3 thousand people checking them out, and so I'm always blown away by that, as opposed to like when I do some films that are like quote unquote bigger Hollywood films. Oh, I did a thing on Avatar, and one of the shows I did on the newer Avatar, only has a couple hundred views, but I'll do one movie I did, which this totally obscure exploitation movie called Judgment Night, totally underground, has got about 2 or 3 thousand hits in less than a day. So I'm like, wow, like what the hell is that about? Like that's pretty awesome. So that's one thing I've been really really surprised by. Where there seems to be a much bigger audience for those kinds of films, and there seems to be a lot more interest, or I don't know if you want to call it, but a little bit more of a buzz, and it seems to grab people's attention a lot more. So that's awesome, because at the end of the day, that's really what I want the focus to be on this channel, is on those films that no one's really seen before, and so it's super cool. But before I segue into what this whole show is going to be about, I want to just talk briefly about some of the things happening in the quantum world. This Friday, we have a show at 5:30 at the Poor Farm, which is a really awesome brew pub, nano brewery in Union, Maine. I'm going to be doing a show there at 5:30 this Friday, Friday the 13th, with my really great friend Tom Luther. He has an amazing electronic project called Sphere Music, really atmospheric, very cinematic electronica. He's just one of the most incredible people I know. We've gotten to play together a few times with our bands together, and it's always been a really cool adventure. So we're going to be doing a show this Friday. So if you're around, and it's a free show, it's a really awesome location. So that's coming up, and then the other show we're going to be doing is on January 28th. We're going to be doing a show with another really awesome electronic artist, Spencer Roulard's Method for Madness. He was just a guest on my show on Film Fanatic, and he was incredible. I thought it was an awesome show, really interesting. Super. He's a super uh, interesting guy, and we talked about music in films, composers, things that were that have always been inspirational to us as writers or just as people. Uh, Phenomenal show, super cool guy. But we're going to be doing a show on January 28th at the Gypsy Rose in Camden, Maine, which is a new venue that is part of. It's a tavern, it's a bar, but it's inside the Cedar Crest, which is in Camden, Maine. So this will be our first time going or playing at this venue. It just opened last week. My friend Emmett has been doing some stuff there. He did an open mic there recently, and that's going to be every week. He's also playing there this Friday. So it's cool that there's like a few different things happening during the middle of winter, and they're all really close and local. So that show is going to be great. Method of Madness is just this incredible like modular project that Spencer has put together, and it's I don't know, it's just really atmospheric, but it's this will be more of a more or less we're kind of billing it as a little bit more of a dance party, like more of a featured thing. We'll be doing playing music that's probably a little bit more upbeat and hopefully getting people dancing and shaking. So that's going to be at 9 o'clock, 9 to 11, January 28th. So very excited about that. I just started promoting, put up the event page for that show. So stay tuned for that. And then the other show we're going to be doing, Spencer also has a really great radio show on WRFR, which is a community-run grassroots radio station here in Rockland, Maine. And he has a really awesome electronic music show on Saturdays, and we're going to be doing a live show on air probably in a couple weeks. So stay tuned for that. We'll basically have like a more or less like an hour set of where we'll play, and then I believe the plan is that we're going to both play together. We had the opportunity, gotten a chance to play with Spencer a couple times, and super cool. And the last time we played together, we ended up kind of jamming and playing actually together, where we had both of our rigs and our setups set up together, and we basically played together, and it was just a really awesome experience. I had never done that before with Quantum, so that was a whole new I don't know, kind of a journey. And so really excited about doing some more shows with him, and he's really just an incredibly talented guy. So if you get a chance, please come out to that show as well. It's really great because now there's a whole pool of different electronic artists that I know, and we all happen to be playing at some capacity anyway, and that we're also friends. But there's all of a sudden there's like a pool of all of these electronic artists around here in Mid-Coast Maine, and it's wild because that really hasn't been a thing that I for a long time. So very excited about moving forward and trying to do these shows around our shows, but also trying to bring in other people that are doing similar styles, and the main focus being on original material. It's not a DJ scenario. It's going to be all set up to be to feature original music. So I'm very excited about that, and moving forward, that's kind of the focus that I want to do as far as the plan or game plan, if you want to call it that. Moving forward and booking shows where I want it to always be like kind of a showcase thing and always have some more variety going on. So very excited about that. So that brings me to today's show, which is going to be all about one of the most notorious collection of films, particularly the first one. There's about 4 or 5 films in the collection, and that is Faces of Death from 1978. And this film in particular, the first one, but all of them are kind of in the same category. Probably, one of the most notorious, one of the most controversial films that has ever come out, if you even want to call it a film. It's a combination of real footage and also fictional footage. I have a really strange and long history with this film and these films, Faces of Death, that came out in 1978. Really unusual, really strange, which kind of makes sense given what this movie is. And it was released in 1978. It was directed by John Allen Schwartz. And the original film, Faces of Death, made the Video Nasties list. And the Video Nasties list was basically a ratings board was formed in the late 70s that basically heralded in this era of censorship. And so what this board did was they basically put pressure and were involved with legal battles with distributors for video stores and also theaters and directors, where they were able to more or less pass a law where these films were more or less looked at as like criminal acts, and that it became, for a while it became illegal, and it started in England, but it became illegal for certain films that were considered to be really graphic exploitation films to be shown, because they felt that these films were condoning violence and murder and rape. So there was a list compiled by this organization of these films, and they were basically banned. And Faces of Death was one of the first films that was put on the Video Nasties list. And it was banned in over 46 countries, which is unbelievable. And just looking back at that now and that history is just mind-boggling. But at the end of the day, that really, coming out of that dark period, it really helped that industry. It really spurred more of an interest of these ideas of like, obtaining as a kid or as a fan of grimy exploitation movies. Suddenly these things were like the forbidden fruit, and so you needed to taste it. It just increased, it suppressed everything, so it just increased your appetite if you were really into the style of into the genre. It just increased your appetite. So all of these films like were eventually re-released after that dark period, and the censorship thing went away, thankfully. And now all of these films are readily available on Blu-ray, 4K. I mean, it's wild, but I really feel like that aspect of where these films were banned for a period of time, it just increased the demand, So it's wild. And the Faces of Death, like the history that I have of it is really long and kind of strange, because again, like I've said, I grew up as a kid in the 80s. I grew up at the very tail end of beta. When I first became aware of films, the beta craze. I mean, first it was, obviously films could only be seen in theaters, and then eventually beta came out, which was like basically the 8-track version of films, where it's basically a giant cassette. But now there was a period where beta came out, and people could buy beta machines and watch movies and go to a video store and rent these beta tapes, and they were like these little kind of cartridges, and you could watch movies at in the privacy of your own home, and you could also record over them. You could also tape them. You could tape things off of TV. So it changed the whole like platform, but beta died a pretty quick death. And then VHS came about, and that really was a huge thing. And that essentially, changed the whole Grindhouse thing. It kind of ushered the end of that. So suddenly, all of these movies that you could see, that you would only get the chance to see in the Grindhouse cinema or drive-ins, you could now rent at your local video store and watch them on VHS. But when I was born, I remember beta being a thing, and or I should say, when I first came into like awareness as a little kid, beta had just ended. It had just like gone under. So VHS was really, I remember as a kid, like suddenly VHS took off and it was this big, huge thing. So that was my my first deep dive into watching movies. That was like what we did as a family. We would go to the local video store. We would go on a Friday night or a Saturday as a family, go to the local video store and rent a bunch of VHS tapes. And I, from an early age, I was always attracted to the darker things, so I always gravitated towards going to the horror section, science fiction. As a kid, I used to read. My first kind of introduction to horror was reading, when I was in middle school, was about, was coming across the writing of Edgar Allan Poe, and I was just completely fascinated and obsessed with that stuff as a kid. That was the first, like, I guess you could say the first, um, his books were, and his short stories and his poems were the first things I ever read as a kid. And I remember at one point in middle school where I did, we had to do a reading of his stuff, but we also were assigned to do like little projects, like a book report on his stuff. And I think I did something, with the about the Raven or the fall of House of Usher. So I, really got into his stuff, and that was literally my introduction. And I had read a few other things that were non-horror related as a kid, but that was what started that fire of where I started to really love the whole like kind of dark aesthetic, the horror element. So that's really the key point, and the key start for me as far as my love of horror was Edgar Allan Poe. That's where it started. And then so naturally for films, when I discovered that and seeing movies on cable and various forms, particularly VHS, that's what I gravitated towards. So I started, seeing all of these great horror classics, Gates of Hell, Lucio Fulci, a bunch of his movies, House by the Cemetery, um, movies like Reanimator, The Car, uh, uh, Dark Dark Night of the Scarecrow, just all of these great exploitation movies that were coming out, but they were on cable at the time. And then also, I used to rent them all the time. And over a few years of doing that, I came across Faces of Death, and I was like, "Wow, what is that?" And this looked like something that was right away on the cover. It had these warnings saying basically these things were, these the footage that was in these films was real. So it became this extra taboo of this. I don't know if you want to call it that, but like another level of forbidden fruit to taste or to try out. And I remember what coming across and I remember like it was yesterday, but it being in a video store, and those movies were very popular and very notorious back then. And I remember they had the one video store we used to go to. They had all four of the movies, the Faces of Death, which was a series, and there were all these warnings on the tapes that, well, this was like real footage. You need to like, you know, watch this with a lot of caution. And so eventually I got the nerve to try to rent them, and I remember convincing my parents, or convincing my mom that, well, this is like, like actually talking to them and saying, well, this is like Friday the 13th. This is all like, it's kind of like Jason Voorhees. It's a slasher movie. It's make believe. And I remember as a kid lying to my parents about it, and I somehow after kind of doing it for a while, I convinced them that Faces of Death was a fake, was a work of fiction. It was like a slasher movie. So they ended up letting me rent them, and and I remember watching the first Faces of Death, and it just was, at that time, at that age, it was one of the most, definitely the most horrific thing I'd ever seen. And I got to this point of where I started renting the other tapes, and I started seeing them, and I watched them quite a bit as a kid. And then one day, I used to watch them late at night when my parents would be asleep. I wouldn't watch them around them, obviously. And at that time, we had a couple of, we lived in a house where it was a fairly large house, but also a fairly small house. And we had a two-level house, and we had a family living room upstairs where we had a VHS player in the upstairs. But downstairs, my dad had a little studio in another area where there was also another VHS player. And I remember, like, at night, when everybody would be asleep, I would go downstairs and watch Faces to Death because I knew my parents couldn't watch it and they shouldn't see it. And I remember it being just like completely shocking and completely frightening, but yet I still watched them. And I remember over a period of time I rented all of those movies. And I remember my mom one day put in one of the tapes, and I don't think I was home, and she watched one of them, and she was completely horrified, and she got really mad at me for lying to her about them, and she also said, "You're never going to watch these again." And from that day on, whenever I would go to the video store, I kind of got in a lot of trouble for renting them, but she wouldn't let me, rent them anymore because she's like, "No, this is like, this is disgusting. Like these are actually, this is actually, this is real footage of people being killed and animals getting killed. So, this is something that a kid should not be seeing." And she was kind of right in some ways, but so I was never allowed to see those movies again. And the only way I could see them, this is obviously way before the internet, so the only way I could see them would be to rent them. So I couldn't see them for years and years and years. And I didn't see them for years and years and years. And then it was funny and weird. A couple of years ago, I think it was last year or the year before. It was like 2 years ago. Back before I was doing this YouTube channel, for some reason I started thinking of Faces of Death. I was like, oh yeah, right, Faces of Death, like that really gruesome, kind of documentary that came out, which was, the main focus was about the act of death, and how kind of cruel the human race is, and how, in a lot of ways, the human race is the most cruel. They're, we're the most cruel creatures on the face of the planet, and also it deals exclusively, or the idea of of these movies deals exclusively with our mortality, and it shows those things. At least I believed that when I was a kid, and so I thought, well, okay, I would rationalize it in my head that, well, this is a reality check. I was always attracted to dark things, and I knew that this thing was at a new level. This was real, so it was crossing a little bit of a threshold. But I knew it was real, or at least assumed it was real, and it was like, this is what, this is our reality, or this is a facet or part of our reality, of our reality as a species. We're capable, as human beings, we're capable of, wonderful acts of, humility or kindness and love, but we're also, capable of these monstrous acts, with, best example of that would be Adolf Hitler and the attempt of, annihilating the Jewish race and the Jewish culture through genocide. And there's been so many other examples of that. And also the use of, the idea of animal cruelty and what we'll do to other animals that are weaker to us. So, in some ways, I always justified that, even at a young age, where I was like, well, this is something that needs to be seen or talked about, because we are these creatures, capable of all of these different ways of life, but we're at the end of the day, we're incredibly, we can be incredibly monstrous and worse than probably any other animal on the face of the earth, because of what we will do to each other and around those things. But so, like, about 2 years ago, like, again, I had not seen any of these films in years and years, and so I don't know what it was. It was like a couple of years ago, and it was before I was doing, obviously, this YouTube channel. It was, and I had just, it's been about a year or 2 years since I started doing, about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, I started doing these Facebook Live videos where I, for a long time, I've had the Film Fanatic Facebook page for about 4 or 5 years, and originally it was focused on just, coverage of movies, and I would do little reviews. I would, have clips of movies. I just, used to post a lot of things about trailers, and that's changed a lot too. But the overall kind of way I did that channel then is about the same now, where I just kind of, basically did these little reviews on films that I really love. And then about a year and a half ago, I had this idea of trying to expand the channel, maybe bring in some new interest and try some new things. So I started doing these Facebook Live reviews. And I noticed, okay, this is kind of a cool thing. I was really reluctant to do the live video thing because I don't really never really felt comfortable speaking in public, and I've always been nervous around that. But I figured, well, this could be a cool thing to maybe expand the audience. And it's a good, I think it's a good skill set for people to acquire, just in general. It helps build a little bit more confidence. It helps you try to maybe articulate certain ideas a little bit more. So I looked at it as a challenge, and so I started doing these videos, and I noticed that they were, for what it is, small potatoes, but I saw that a lot of people were checking out these videos, and I was, excited about doing. So I started doing them fairly regularly, like once or twice a month. And then over time, I had a lot of people approach me saying, "Well, you should start an Instagram page for Film Fanatic. You should, Instagram is this new thing. It's got a lot of traction." And I was always reluctant to try to get another kind of social media platform thing going, because then I'm like, oh, it's going to be that much more things to worry about or think about. And then I did some, exploring around Instagram, and I realized, well, it is great, and as far as promotional use, and it doesn't have the drama aspect that Facebook sometimes has, like where people use it as a personal diary. So I ended up putting up a Facebook page. I mean, sorry, a Instagram Film Fanatic page, and I realized, oh, this is cool. So I started doing videos for that as well, and I started noticing that people were starting to, chime in and check out the page. And then there was also the same people that were doing that were also helping out the Film Fanatic page that's been on Facebook for quite a few years. So it was fun, and I started doing a couple other projects. I started reviewing, even more of a variety of films, and then I started writing reviews. After that, I started writing reviews for Opera House Video, and I did that for about a year, and that was like these series of published reviews I've been writing. So I just, it got the gears going in my head as far as trying to think of new ideas and new things to kind of push things forward. And for whatever reason, about 2 years ago, I started thinking about, oh yeah, I remember this movie. If you don't want to call it a movie, but this collection of films called Faces to Death, and I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. I haven't seen that in years, since I was a kid, and then it brought back the whole story and my memory of my childhood around that. So I started looking it up online, and I was like, "Oh yeah, Jesus, I haven't seen these in years, and I wonder if they're available somewhere. Like, if, could I find them?" And I came across this really interesting thing on YouTube where it was a really cool like documentary, or more or less an interview with the creators of Faces of Death, and it was an interview with the producers and also with Alan Schwartz, who was the director of the original one, and also the other films that came after that. That and they all came out in the 70s, 78, and in the next 3 or 4 years they each came out. Um, and I watched this interview, and they were talking about how a lot of he broke it down, like the director Alan Schwartz was talking about in this interview, where he was saying it was like 60% of the footage in the Faces of Death was completely staged, and then but 40% of the footage in the series was real. And I was like, wow, like that's crazy, because as a kid, I it was one of those things where I don't know, I was like really torn about watching it, and then also fascinated with it, at the same time. But I always thought growing up as a kid that this stuff was real. So it was really interesting, and Alan Schwartz was talking about how they, as they were filmmakers, and this was like one of their first projects, and when they worked with this company that was going to distribute them, they wanted them to try to have a lot of fictional and kind of a mockumentary documentary style. So a lot of the stuff became staged, and they felt that that could help with the marketing. So they blended fictional footage and non-fictional footage of actual scenes of autopsies and pretty heinous scenes of animal cruelty. Plus, there was all kinds of scenes of where they were using actors, and it was all staged. And that was a real like eye-opening interview. I was like, wow, okay, this a lot of this stuff was fake, but still some of it was definitely real. And then like about a month or so after I saw that interview, I was in, of all places, I was in Goodwill in Rockland, and I came across this, and I couldn't believe it that they had Faces of Death. Not only was the first movie on here, but the collection of all four movies was on here. It was on DVD, and it was for $2. And I was just like, how crazy is that, and how ironic is that? That of all places, I'm gonna find Faces of Death. I'm gonna find it at Goodwill, and I was just like, you gotta be kidding me. So I rented it. I shouldn't say I rented it. I bought it. I bought it for $2, and I've watched it, and I started watching it again last night, and it's watching it now and knowing that a lot of it was staged. Like again, Alan Schwartz was saying about 60% is staged, the rest 40% is all real. It still has that completely mixed reaction from me. Like you feel kind of disgusted watching it, but then you're fascinated by it, particularly around the animal cruelty scenes. And one of the most horrific things of this movie is there are lots of scenes of animals being killed at slaughterhouses. And if anything would make you become a vegetarian, it would be that. I mean, it's basically like a concentration camp for animals. There's no thought into putting some semblance of decency for these animals to be slaughtered, or to be put to death. I mean, they're tortured, and it's terrifying. And the whole opening sequence of the film, or it's real footage of basically of these cadavers, and there's all these autopsy scenes. A lot of the other that are very much real, and that's pretty graphic and just kind of hard to watch, obviously. But it's real, and it is what it is. And the obvious all of the other footage that I've seen after watching it after all these years, is obviously staged. You can tell that there's a lot of actors, and but on the from a cinematic point of view, it's really interesting on how the filmmakers and how Alan Schwartz assembled all of this footage and kind of blurred the line. And it's again, it's from the '70s, so it the cinematography, it's all really gritty, it's all raw, it's all shot on like crappy film, and it's like just steeped in the pure world of horror exploitation. So the way it's shot, and it's got all of this narration and voiceover, it from that aesthetic point of view, it's pretty awesome. Like how well done that part of it is. It's pretty seamless, and it's totally a pure representation of exploitation horror films. But at the same time, there are scenes of real death. There's obviously filled. It's still focused, and there are real scenes of real death and brutality. So it's not something you're gonna like casually watch or something you're gonna put in. It doesn't necessarily have that entertainment value because of that, particularly around the animal cruelty parts. Um, but I think it definitely as a series has a voice, and it does say something. I to say I get enjoyment out of it is would be not a thing, but I would say from a fan of being exploitation of a fan of the horror exploitation world, and particularly around the footage in these documentaries, or you should say mockumentaries, the way it's shot and the way it's put together and the narrative is really interesting and super cool. Like the footage is it's super gritty, and it's like watching like a Herschel Gordon Lewis movie, but with some real stuff in it. So and that's like that's my favorite period of filmmaking. So from that kind of perspective, it's really awesome. Subject matter, obviously it's not awesome, but it's real, and it is fascinating. And I remember there being this weird backlash when, for so many years, people who watch these films, if you want to call it fans of these films, always believed, like myself included, always believed that the Faces of Death series was real. And there was this weird backlash. I remember when it came out that while a lot of the stuff was staged, there was a lot of people that kind of started jumping on it or trashing the movie, saying, "Well, it was fake, so it's not the real deal. Don't check it out," or it's not it's overly hyped, which is weird because then that kind of crosses. That's like part of the argument that, well, then people were fans of this film, so I don't know, it's a slippery slope. Sometimes I think there's I like one aspect I like about this film and this collection of the film is it definitely exemplify it's an exemplar of, or exemplifies the idea of like kind of one of the ultimate taboos, and how you're presented with that taboo, and how if you feel a natural desire to kind of explore that taboo. And it pushes the boundaries. It definitely pushes the boundaries. But I think it blurs that line between, entertainment and where it's not entertainment. It's an interesting thing. And I almost think of it to a degree like in the analogy of a little bit. It's a little bit outside of that, but I think it's kind of related to that analogy. And particularly around our fascination with serial killers. That is has been a huge at the end of the day a huge money making subject. And with our cultural kind of fascination with serial killers, you know, things like Silence of the Lambs, which are works of fiction, but then also true crime, the true crime fascination, and that's always been a fascinating thing. Again, playing into the idea of studying the psychology of man and various forms of murder and what kind of shapes the psychotic nature of those acts. That's always been a fascinating thing, and also a topic in lots of fictional movies, like say the slasher film. But then you have the realistic thing of where people become fascinated by true life killers, serial killers, Henry Lee Lucas, Ted Bundy, Jeffrey Dahmer, and all of those characters have been made into, well, to a degree, rock stars. It's kind of wild, but where Charles Manson, but where lots of movies, TV shows. Recently, there was just a Netflix show that was created around about Jeffrey Dahmer's life. There's been movies made about him, and and that whole aspect of our dark nature in reality has been inspirational for lots of fictional films. One of the biggest examples is the notorious serial killer Ed Gein, who was was one of the, if not the biggest influence for the creation of Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and particularly around Leatherface. And it's always interesting and fascinating. I've always been interested in that world, but there's also a line that gets blurred, I think, to a degree where like one example can be of, like, say, John Wayne Gacy, who was a notorious serial killer, and while he was in prison, he started making he was a painter, and he started to become really prolific as a painter, and people were buying his paintings, and he was actually making a profit from his work. So it crosses that line of, here's somebody who's responsible for all of these like horrible atrocities, but he's actually making money off of his name. So it always like rides that line, or totes that line. And I know of somebody personally who is really into serial killers, like fascinated, but at another level that I've never really seen before. And she was telling me, and she's, we have a lot of the same tastes in horror films, and also, the whole dark kind of aesthetic. But she was telling me that she went to an art opening, and this was in Chicago, where the whole premise of the art of this art gallery and what they were showing was paintings, and various forms of other art, visual art, that was all created by real life serial killers. Like there was work by John Wayne Gacy, and I believe like Ted Bundy, but a whole bunch of different serial killers that are real monsters, but they were also creating these art projects. And this gallery was specializing in showing just their work. And you could buy these paintings. And this person I know actually bought a couple of original prints of John Wayne Gacy. And I wonder about that, where I think, it's all subjective, and I'm not a judgmental person that way, but I think it brings into question, like, okay, who's actually profiting for that? I think the idea that, at face value, I think, say, for example, John Wayne Gacy, one of the most, you know, disgusting and vile serial killers in modern times. The idea that if he's creating art, or creating, some kind of art-related project, or something that he can sell, and that he presents it to the public and people start buying it, does he start making a profit off of that? And essentially, the profit is essentially blood money, at the end of the day. So it's a fine balance of where. And then somebody else had told me that I know, that I actually play music with, had told me this wild story where he's friends with somebody who's also, this guy has this deep if you can call it, but a love, a deep love, but an obsession with a lot of dark things, horror movies and various other things. But he has an obsession with serial killers, and he was saying, well, yeah, like when you go into his room or his house, he's got posters of Richard Ramirez up, and he's got like tattoos of him. The Night Stalker, responsible for how many deaths, and total psychopath. So it's kind of like, I don't know, like it totes that line of how far a person should go, and and if somebody makes a profit off of that. And I sometimes feel that way. I sometimes have mixed things. I don't believe in censorship in any form or another. I think the concept or idea of art is definitely kind of an individually based thing. But I think profit over for death is a pretty fine line, and it's pretty obvious where that can go. One other example I think of too, in my own terms, I don't collect any paintings of serial that were created by serial killers. I don't really feel comfortable doing that. But at the same time, another subject that I am kind of related to, or that is related to me, that is similar, is the like for instance, a book that I really find fascinating, although it's hard to read, but it is fascinating, and it's a part of history, is Mein Kampf, which was basically Adolf Hitler's manifesto when he was in art school before he, you know, took power in Nazi Germany and created the Third Reich. And it's basically his manifesto of how he felt the world should be. And, and it's an interesting book to say the least, but like the first half of that book, he basically talks about things of, kind of growing up as this underdog and having this like real suppressed nature. People, I think in an everyday walk of life, or from an everyday walk of life, can kind of identify with that. But then it goes into a realm of where he is like outwardly racist and completely anti-Semitic, and it just takes this turn of where you get about 30 pages in, you're like, this guy is completely insane and just a megomaniacal monster. So obviously you distance yourself from that, but it's still a work of history. And so the idea too, where I have a copy of that, and that is looked at as a book, and it has been a book that's been banned for many years, and I have a copy of that. So then it's the idea of like, if Hitler was still alive, would he get that profit from that? And it's like crossing, could be, it's subjective to a degree, but it could be crossing a line of profit for death, more or less. So it's an interesting thing, and I also feel a little bit in the same field with Faces of Death, of where does it tote that line? I don't, making money off of something of where people are actually being tortured and killed, or there really isn't that aspect of that. It's more with Faces of Death. I think it's mostly centered on animal cruelty. So it does cross that line. Most of those things involving humans, like cannibalism, are in accident scenes. A lot of those things are fake, or done in a mockumentary style. They're not real, but a lot of the other scenes are real, dealing mostly with animal cruelty. But so it's a little bit of a different thing, but it's an interesting question that I think people who are collectors or who are fascinated with very taboo subjects, where that threshold goes and where you can take it, or where you feel comfortable. Faces of Death is not something I can, like, I have all the first four movies. It's not something I would say I could binge watch. I have to watch it in at a limited capacity. After a while, it kind of does get to me after a while, and I can't really sit through too much of it. I think it is pretty interesting and fascinating. And again, the thing that I like about it is the way it was shot, the cinematography, that real grindhouse kind of vibe to it. And the music is really great. The atmosphere is really great. And that's more of a theatrical thing. But when it's the reality of some of the footage that you're seeing, particularly around the animal cruelty thing, it's hard, but it's real, you know. So there's a balance with that, but it's not something I can just like I couldn't binge watch Faces of Death and watch all four of the movies back to back. They're all relatively short, about an hour, but it's hard. So, but I am interested in these films. I do think that they do have something to say. I think they do have a certain quality to them that I do like. But I just, you know, wanted to do a show on these films because of my history with them. And I think it does raise some interesting questions about, you know, morality or ethics. And I know all of those things are completely subjective as to you know what a person has in regards to their own personal ethics or values. So, but fascinating stuff. Nevertheless. So this is Jason Dean, and I want to thank everyone for checking out this show. This has been a blast doing all of these videos. And if you like this show and like this channel at Film Fanatic, please like and subscribe to it. And we will see you next time. Peace. Have a great day.